So back to the webinar. So Professor Boschma is going to talk about resilience from an evolutionary perspective. One is professor in regional economics at Utrecht University, as well as professor in innovation studies at Stavanger University in Norway. And in his work, Ron laid, among others, the foundations of evolutionary economic geography, which has now become one of the most influential streams in economic geography. So if you have questions, we'll have a Q&A after Ron's presentation. You can ask them directly through the video, or you can type them in the group chat, and then we're gonna address them. So that's it. Ron, the floor is yours. Oh, right. One last thing. Everybody, if you could turn off the microphone, so we limit the amount of background noise.
All
now
right.
The floor is yours.
All right. Thanks very much, Simona. It's a real pleasure. Thanks for the invitation. It's really nice to be on this kind of program. I'm not experienced in doing this, giving a webinar, but I'm thrilled to do it. So I hope it all works well, and that everybody will enjoy it as much as I do. Yes, I was asked to discuss a bit the latest on the work on regional resilience. There are many people working on this. My team in Utrecht and others have really done a number of papers on that, also taking an evolutionary perspective, which is part of this Evolutionary Economic Geography program that Simona was referring to before. And what we tend to do is, and of course I will come back to that during my lecture, really addressing the notion of regional resilience from an evolutionary perspective. It's a topic that I'm engaged in quite lately, but also other people are working on that. It's very much work in progress, so also it's a kind of open-ended agenda. So I will also come back to that. Okay, now you see I'm a bit in the dark now, but it means all because I'm in a smart building. So if I wave with my hands now and then, it's not because I'm getting even more thrilled than I'm already in, but it's because this is a smart building and I have to move now and then the light will turn on again, I hope. Well, it's not doing it now, but anyway, so yeah, there it goes. All right, so let's go to the structure of my lecture. I will say something on kind of conventional approaches to regional resilience. And that is more or less framed in an equilibrium framework. And then I will move on to an evolutionary perspective, also to show what is the value added of taking an evolutionary approach, at least as far as I'm concerned, because an evolutionary approach would focus much more on the notion of structural change. So actually what it is saying is that if you want to really assess the response of regions to a shock and to what extent they are capable of recovering from a shock, it also means that you have to take into account the ability of regions to develop new growth paths, because part of their recovery process is about to what extent they can compensate for processes of decline and stagnation in their region due to the shock. To what extent are they capable of compensating by moving into new directions, developing new growth paths? So I think that should be part and parcel of any study on regional resilience, is that how can regions actually compensate processes of decline that are caused by a shock when they're confronted with. So I now will refer to those two types of studies that have taken kind of evolutionary perspective on regional resilience. One is playing with the notion of scale relatedness, which might be important shock absorber, and I will say something on diversification potential of regions and to what extent that is affected by a shock. And I will go briefly into two empirical papers. We did one is on resilience of European regions after the 2008 shock, and the other paper is about the resilience of US regions, in which we really could go back into history, looking at the effects of three major crises: the Long Depression in the 1870s, the Great Depression in the 1930s, and the oil crisis in the 1970s. Okay. So first, a bit about more conventional approaches that are stuck in kind of equilibrium framework. You have what people have referred to as engineering resilience, which is basically about looking at shocks and to what extent regions are resistant to a shock and to what extent they can recover if hit by a shock. Then in this type of framework, the ability of the system to resume its stable equilibrium state following shock, and they are interested in to what extent, if hit by shock, to what extent you are able to return to your previous equilibrium state before a shock. Very much influenced by the plugging model of Friedman, in which you have an upward sloping ceiling on output levels, giving the resources that regions have in terms of supply of capital, labor, technologies, and how these are utilized, and that determines more or less the upward sloping ceiling on the output level. And what they tend to do is then to see to what extent this shock is affecting this ceiling, to what extent it returns to its pre-shock growth rates. So what they actually look at is that shocks are temporary. There's no permanent effect on these region growth paths. There's no structural change analyzed, and it is pretty discrete. Ecological resilience is a bit more rich notion of how to look at regional resilience. It's taken from a multi-cycle equilibrium framework, and there people are interested in to what extent the system is robust, in the sense that what is the magnitude of the shock that it can still absorb before it will change its structure or its function. And the second characteristic is by adaptation, and that's the more central notion of ecological resilience, because it might also be the case that a region, when hit by a shock, might shift from an inferior to a superior long-run equilibrium growth path. And this has been referred to as this Crises in economics. It's more about a permanent impact of a shock due to structural change. You might shift the growth ceiling that I talked about before and move into a higher equilibrium growth rates than before the shock. And this can be visualized by looking at those four examples. You have on the y-axis, you have the employment or output level in a region, and you are at a certain equilibrium growth rate. Then a shock comes in, the employment or output level will go down, and depending on the intensity of the shock, how much the employment or output level will decline. And then there is a recovery phase. You might return to a previous growth rate equilibrium, but it might also be the case that you will move into a more inferior equilibrium growth rate after the shock, or to a superior equilibrium growth rate in the long run. So there are different possibilities here, and this is what really this ecological resilience concept is about. But Again, there is no analysis of structural change going on and how the shock affects the capacity of regions to innovate or diversify. So here I go again. Let's see whether this room is resilient. It is. All right. So that's why we were not completely satisfied with the type of analysis that are done taking an equilibrium approach. What we think is that structural change and the notion of structural change should be made a key ingredient to the analysis of regional resilience. Other authors have already proposed that, like James Simi and Ron Martin, in a publication published in 2010 in the Journal of Regional Economy and Society, in which they say, well, actually, regions have to struggle all the time adapting to new circumstances. Actually, and I just put a quote here, there is an ongoing process rather than only recovery to a pre-existing or new equilibrium state. So regions really have to develop new growth paths all the time to compensate for processes of stagnation and decline in their regional economies. So regions have to be resilient all the time because it is an ongoing process. They will be confronted with processes of failure and stagnation. So they have to be resilient almost on a continuous basis. Still, there's room to analyze shocks in this perspective. But then it's more about the long-term ability of regions to develop new growth paths, right, in order to compensate for those processes of stagnation and decline that will happen anyhow, sooner or later in a region. And relatedness is a key concept in that respect because the main claim of this evolutionary concept of regional resilience is that the degree of relatedness in a region makes regions more resilient. And I will go into that more in detail in the remaining of my talk. There are two types of studies so far that I've more or less grouped together. One is that is looking at labor matching effects. Relatedness can be a major input to make sure that labor that will become redundant due to a shock in a region. Relatedness might provide all kinds of opportunities for alternative jobs and therefore might act as a shock absorber. And the second type of studies is to what extent regions will be capable of developing new economic activities in order to compensate for processes of decline in their region. So those are the two types of studies that I will focus on in the remaining of my talk. Just briefly about this first type of studies, in which relatedness or skill relatedness can be used as a regional shock absorber. Dario Dato and Anat Weterings have published a paper recently in the Journal of Economic Geography, in which they really analyze regional resilience from this relatedness perspective. And they use the notion of skill relatedness, which is not a new notion. They did not introduce it. It's a notion that has been developed by Frank Nefke and Martin Henning in a paper published in 2013 in the Strategic Management Journal, if I'm not wrong, if I recall. And skill related is all about, okay, to what extent do industries share similar skill requirements? And the line of reasoning is as follows, and the way they measure it is the more similar industries are, the more you expect that labor inflows will happen between two industries. And what if they, because those industries share similar skill requirements. So the skills that labor need in one industry are more or less similar in another other industry and still useful and relevant. And therefore, you would expect a high intensity of labor flows between those two industries. So they develop a kind of skill relatedness indicators in which they compare the observed industry labor flows against the baseline. The baseline is defined as the expected inflows from industry I to industry J, based on the size of industries, their growth rate, and their wage level. So you let's say, estimate expected inflows from industry I to industry J based on the size of industries, because the higher the size of an industry, the more you expect. Of course, the higher the growth rate of an industry, the more labor will flow to that industry, and also the higher the wage level of that industry, the more labor will flow to that industry. So you get a kind of baseline taking into account those three types of factors, and then you get a kind of baseline in which you define the expected inflows from industry I to industry J based on those three factors. And then you can kind of get a nice indicator of skill relatedness when the labor flows exceed this baseline, right? So if you control for those three factors, you might still have excessive labor flows, and the more excessive they are, the more skill related the two industries are, right? And you use that information and then you can visualize it and get a network in which each node stands for a particular industry. If there's a link between two nodes, it means that there are skill related. If there's no link between two nodes, it means that there are not skill related. They don't have similar skill requirements, right? So you can see that here those two industries are connected, so they share similar skill requirements, and those two nodes are not connected. So apparently they don't share similar skill requirements above a certain threshold, and that's how it works. And as you can see, some industries, this industry is only skill related to this one, but is not skill related to any other industry in an economy. So it means that it is quite takes a kind of isolated position in this skill related network, right? Well, you have many industries here in the middle that have many relationships with other industries in this skill space, and therefore they have similar skill requirements as many other industries. So here you get a kind of nice taxonomy of all industries depending on the similarity of skill requirements across industries. Okay, going back to the Diodato and Waiterings study. So they use this information to see, okay, to what extent regions are resilient to the 2008 shock. And especially this notion of skill relatedness becomes important when they want to estimate to what extent regions are capable of recovering to the 2008 shock. And they measure that looking at the speed at which unemployed are reabsorbed into the regional labor market. So, as you can imagine, if you have a local supply of skill-related sectors in your region, it means that there are a lot of alternative job opportunities for the ones that become redundant in skill-related industries, right? So, if, for example, one or two sectors are hit by this crisis disproportionately, if they have many industries skill related to those one or two sectors that are in decline, those skill related sectors really provide alternative job opportunities for the ones that have become unemployed in the region. So the more skill related sectors are available at that region, the more the region is capable of reabsorbing those unemployed in the regional labor market. So it will dampen unemployment, and in those terms, the region will show a high degree of resilience. So this is a typical example of how this notion of relatedness and skill relatedness can be really helpful in explaining what regions are expected to be more resilient after a shock. The same type of reasoning is also used when a major plant will decline in a region, or there's a nice paper by Jacob Ullman and Christian Østergaard and others that looked at the closure of major shipyard in Aalborg or in other Danish regions. And they asked the question, okay, what happens with the ones that get unemployed? So will their skills be reused, or will their skills just be destroyed because there's no alternative job opportunity in the region itself? And they look at wage differences between the old and the new jobs of those people. So they look at all those people that worked in those shipyards and became unemployed. And then they will look after a few years what happened with those people. Did they find a new job? And if so, to what extent were their skills that were very relevant in making ships, are they still relevant in those industries where they found an alternative job? And if so, then apparently their skill can be reused, and the wage difference between the old and new job will be very marginal, because their skills are still highly valued also in a new job. So again, the local supply of skill relatedness is indeed crucial for resilience at the level of the workers, right? So if there are a lot of industries skill related to shipyards available in the region, then this region might recover from that shock, because the skills will remain in the region. People that get unemployed will not migrate to other regions to look for alternative jobs, but they will remain in the region, and they will, and those industries that will recruit those unemployed, they might actually benefit from it, because the skills those people have are still very relevant and highly valued for those regions. So this means that also at the level of the workers, you can look at resilience and to what extent the local supply of skill relatedness might make a difference in that respect. All right, so this is the first type of studies, right, that look at regional resilience, and they make use of the notion of skill relatedness and to what extent regions can really recover from a shock by looking at to what extent there are alternative job opportunities in skill-related industries. The second type of studies that I'm now going into is more about to what extent the capacity of regions to develop new industries is affected by the 2008 crisis. So the first, I will look at two studies that actually have taken a look at that from that evolutionary perspective. One is a paper I did with Ying Xiao and Martin Anderson, and it has been published in Industrial Corporate Change in the year 2018. And there we did a study on the resilience of European regions to the 2008 shock. There we used the Orbis database, which is a huge database including millions of firms, and we can draw employment data from that by industry. We could distinguish between several hundred industries, and we could distinguish between 173 NUTS 2 regions in 12 European countries. And what we did there is, as we want to know to what extent this shock affected the capacity of regions to develop new industries, we will compare the levels of industry entry for European regions in the period 2004-2008, which is the period before the crisis, and compare that with levels of industry entry for European regions in the period 2008-2012, which is during and after the crisis. So you can compare the levels of industry entry, and you want to see to what extent the crisis negatively affect this level of industry entry in European regions. And what we were particularly interested in this paper is the entry of knowledge-intensive industries, because those are the ones that are more promising, right? The more complex ones. So if you are capable of entering into new knowledge-intensive industries, you might be very capable of overcoming the crisis, because you provide new job opportunities in the region that are good jobs, knowledge-intensive jobs, and that is what this whole study of resilience should be about, right? So, to what extent can we think about compensation mechanisms in terms of developing new growth paths that can provide new job opportunities to the ones that are affected in the region? So, well, we look at the entry of new industry specializations in a region. So in order to determine industry entry levels in regions, we have to develop an entry and what we define as an entry. So we define an entry of a new industry specialization in a region by looking at location quotients, right? So it's more about to what extent is the share of industry I in region R higher than the share of that industry I in Europe as a whole. And when that is higher than 1, it means that there is a kind of specialization of that new industry. So we just don't take any entry of a firm in an industry that is new to a region, but there should be a substantial presence of that entry in a region, and that is what is proxied by looking at this location quotient. There are also additional rules that we apply. The industry I should also be a major sector in region R, right? It should not be just a very marginal activity, but it should be really an entry of an industry that will become one of the major sectors in that region R. And the third rule we applied is that region R should also be one of the major regions for that industry I in Europe. So again, we look at substantial presence. So not just any entry, but substantial presence of a new industry in a region. And we apply those 3 rules to define, okay, what is an entry in our framework. Then we moved on and we say, okay, we will define resilient regions as regions that consist of 2 types. Type A resilient region is one that is able to remain high entry levels after the crisis, and type B is that resilient regions of type B are the ones that can even increase their entry levels after the shock. So they're even capable of using the crisis in fact to even increase their performance, increase their entry levels after the shock. And as you can see, there are 25 regions in our population that actually were capable of improving their entry levels, and that to us is the highest form of resilience, right? So instead of being negatively affected on entry, it has a positive effect on entry in those regions. They were actually capable of exploiting the crisis to increase their entry level. So we use a dependent variable in this study, and that takes the value of 1 if a region has been resilient, either of type A and type B, then it gets the value of 0 if it has not shown resilience according to this definition. Here we have a kind of overview of all the regions that were defined as being resilient in knowledge-intensive industries, right? So whether it maintained high entry levels in knowledge-intensive industries after the shock, or whether it even increased entry levels after the shock. And so this is always a nice map, right? Geographers love that. So you can talk for hours about this map, but maybe I should not do that because of the time. But just to show you a map which, according to our definition, were the most resilient regions when looking at entry levels before and after the crisis. Okay, and then we estimate a model in which we looked at well, our main variables of interest were related and unrelated variety, which actually mean, okay, how is the composition of your sectors in a region, and to what extent those industries might have might mean something to each other, and to what extent it is not. If they mean something to each other, it means that those industries are related. If they cannot really mean something to each other, it means that they are unrelated. This is following a very well-known paper, highly influential paper by Koen Frenken and others, a study published in Regional Studies in 2007. They use entropy measures in order to define related and unrelated variety. They make use of different digit levels of sectoral classification. Basically, how related variety is measured in our work is we look at the weighted sum of four-digit variety at the four-digit level within each two-digit class. So it means that, okay, at the two-digit level, for example, you have the chemical industry. When you go to a more detailed level at the four-digit industry, you look at how much variety in the chemical industry at the two-digit level is present at the four-digit level. So how many sub-branches in chemicals are around in a region? The more there are, the higher the variety that is related because they share the same two-digit class, right? And you sum that up for all two-digit industries. So you get a related variety measure in which actually firms, industries tend to have something in common. They are related and can mean something to each other. And our unrelated variety measure is the variety of at the two-digit level. So it might still be useful, but it's a different type of variety that we are interested in. And then we control for a number of variables, population density. It might be the case that if many people are living in a region, it might affect entry levels of industries in the region. We control for average growth rate of GDP per capita, the level of GDP, the share of science and technology workers, which might be a kind of proxy for human capital, and the higher the human capital, the more entry you would expect in a region. We control for levels of gross capital formation per employee. We control for quality of government and a number of other control variables. And then the main findings are reported in this table. The probability of being resilient as a region in knowledge-intensive sector is positively affected by both the degree of related variety and unrelated variety. So having a variety of sectors in your region make you more resilient in terms of increasing the entry levels after the 2008 shock. As you can see, the variables are only significant in the type B resilience, which going back to my definition, if you can recall, that is the type B is that regions are even capable of increasing their entry levels after the shock. So it makes that related and unrelated variety in a region have a positive effect on that type of being resilient. And then there are all the control variables. So I think this is already an important outcome, showing that indeed related and unrelated variety actually matter. Related variety more than unrelated variety. So it really can be a key ingredient, a key variable that makes whether a region is resilient or not, in terms of whether they're capable of maintaining or increasing their entry levels after 2008. So this is the first study in that. The second one I would like to bring to your attention in the last 10 minutes of my talk is this is a study on resilience of US regions through 3 major crises, and it goes really back into the debate to what extent major crises are good or bad for diversification in regions. And this is a paper I've done with a PhD student of mine, Mathieu Stein, and there are other co-authors involved, Pierre-Alex Balland and a colleague of mine in Utrecht, and David Brigby, who's working at UCLA. And it's still a working paper. We already submitted to a journal, but we are still waiting for the referees to wake up and then send us some feedback. What we are interested in is a really old debate: to what extent major crises are good or bad for diversification, right? And it goes really back to the long wave theory that was really well developed and discussed in the 1970s and 1980s. And actually, you had 2 opposing views in those days. One was saying, okay, crises are good for diversification, right? It is good for the introduction of major technological breakthroughs or major innovation, because demand will drop dramatically during crisis, and returns on investment on existing products and technology will be very low. So it's actually a very good period to try out new things and more radical things. So there is a strong incentive for investors to come up with new technological breakthroughs and introduce them into the economic system. Also, the incentive is even stronger during periods of crisis, because there might be all kinds of productive forces that are set free during a crisis. So there will be unemployed, so wages will go down, lower capital cost will be around. So it will. So it's a kind of interesting setting in order to try out new things and invest in new breakthroughs. And this already goes back to good old Schumpeter that developed this hypothesis, but there have been many people that have taken on board this kind of thinking in the 1970s and 1980s. One of them, for example, is my fine colleague, Alfred Kleinknecht, who did a PhD thesis on that in the 1980s, actually developing this notion of depression trigger hypothesis. And then you have the opposing view, the demand pull hypothesis, right, by Smugler and Shearer, well developed, that say, no, crisis is very bad to introduce major technological breakthrough. There's just too much uncertainty going on. The whole economy is in decline. So people will just postpone investments. And that is even true for the more radical initiatives, because they are even more risky and more uncertain to implement anyhow. And so major crises will be very bad timing to introduce those, because it is already very risky, and major crises will just add to that uncertainty. So those schoolers will just claim that breakthroughs will be introduced in the growth phase or the prosperity phase of an economy, because that is more a kind of setting in which this type of investments are encouraged. So we take those 2 opposing views on board, and apply it to our literature on regional diversification and regional resilience. So the big question is, which two of those views prevail at the regional scale? To our knowledge, no study has been done yet on that, taking these kind of theories on board. And our hypothesis is, and I must say I'm much more on the line of the demand pool hypothesis. So what we would expect is that cities diversify less during crisis than a non-crisis period, right? Because it is very risky to do so. And then the second type of question we raised was, okay, what type of diversification takes place in periods of major crisis? So if regions diversify, to what extent will they do so in related or unrelated activities? And our hypothesis is here that cities diversify more in related activities in crisis than in non-crisis period, because due to the uncertainty, they will stay very close to what they have been doing in the past. So they will not make major jumps, because major jumps, more radical new activities, will not be very attractive to introduce during periods of crisis, because it's already very risky and uncertain. And just to explain what is the difference between related and unrelated diversification, I just included this figure, in which in region A you have a typical process of related diversification, because you're first specialized in motorbikes, then you move into car making, and then you move into car trucks. You diversify, but you do so in very related activities, because the capabilities that you need to diversify from one activity to another is more or less similar. In this case, you need engineering capabilities, right? So you don't have to transform the underlying capabilities at the regional scale to move into new activities, to diversify into new economic activities. And this is stands in contrast to region B, where I visualized unrelated diversification, because you're first specialized in textiles, then you specialize in aircraft making, and then you move into a new specialization in pharmaceuticals. And as you can understand, each time you move into a new field, it means that the underlying capabilities at the regional scale should be completely transformed. And you need completely different capabilities to excel in aircraft making as compared to textiles. So therefore, unrelated diversification is more an exception, because it is very risky and uncertain. So going back to the hypothesis 2, therefore we expect that if cities diversify, they diversify in more related activities during crisis period as compared to non-crisis period, because it is already very uncertain and very risky to move into and diversify into new economic activities. So we used, in this paper, we used historical pattern data set, which was developed by Sergio Pettalia and others. And so we really could go back in time. We have pattern data covering the period 1836 to 2002. We could look into 3 major crises in US history. So instead of just looking at the 2008 crisis, we can really go back in time, and we can actually look at 3 major crises. We looked at the Long Depression in the 1870s, the Great Depression in the 1930s, and the oil crisis in the 1970s. And we did an analysis of all metropolitan statistical areas that had some patent activities. And they should have an average of 10 patents per year to be included in the analysis. And we had about 300, I think about 300 different metropolitan statistical areas that we could identify. And then we identified crises at the regional level through those 3 major crises. So, and we defined those as sustained period of negative growth in patent activity. So there should be a substantial decline of patenting activity of at least 35% of the total patent activity in that region. So there should be a real regional crisis in that. Okay, just for the matter of, for the sake of time, and just move on a bit. The dependent variable we use is whether you enter a new technology class that is new to the region or not. And again, it should be substantial present. So we proxy that by revealed comparative advantage, which is more or less the same as the location quotient I explained before in the previous studies. And then we are interested in to what extent okay, so our population in this analysis is all technologies that are not yet present in a region. So they have a revealed comparative advantage of less than 1, and we include those in the analysis, and then we are interested to see to what extent potential technologies enter or not in a region or not. So this is the entry model that we estimate. And whether they enter or not might depend on the degree of relatedness with existing technologies in the region, right? So that is our first independent variable, which is referred to as a relatedness density variable. I won't go too much into detail in that, but the idea is that if you have many technologies that are in a region that are related to a potential new technology in the region, you expect that technology is more likely to enter that region. So this is how it is assessed. If you have any questions on that, of course, I'm willing to answer those. But for the sake of time, I just set out the main idea. Another independent variable was, of course, whether cities are in crisis or not, which, of course, is in order important to determine whether cities are in crisis are more will show more entry of a technology class new to a region or not. And we controlled for population in a city and to what extent a technology might enter a region depending on to what extent neighbor regions are already specialized in that technology. And we accounted also for this neighboring effect by using spatial awakening. Okay, so the first hypothesis that we wanted to test, right? Do cities diversify less during crisis than non-crisis period? And as you can see in this table, we have the regression results here, and the dependent variable we split into 5 observations, meaning that the okay, I'm use the cursor. Here you have to 20% is meaning this is the relatedness, the technologies that show the lowest degree of relatedness with existing technologies in a region. Well, the 80 to 100% are the technologies that have the highest relatedness score. And as you can see, the crisis period has a negative effect on the entry probability of a new technology in a region. So apparently, crises are bad to introduce new technological specializations in a region. So this is more or less the confirmation where we got from this analysis. The negative effect is relevant for all types of technologies with low relatedness and high relatedness. So the crisis period is always has a negative effect on the probability of a city entering a new technology. So, so this confirms our first hypothesis: cities diversify less during crisis than non-crisis period. And then we moved on to our second hypothesis, right? So we already see that cities are less inclined to diversify during crisis periods. But if they diversify, do they do so in related activities or in more unrelated activities? And of course, we expect that they do so in more related activities, so they stay very close to what they have been doing in the past, because it is already very risky to diversify during a period of crisis. And it's actually, this is what is shown in this figure. Again, on the x-axis, you see the quantile groups. Those are the technologies 0 to 20% with the lowest degree of relatedness. Here, from 80 to 100%, the technologies with the highest degree of relatedness. On the y-axis, what is shown there is the difference in percent between entry probabilities during a crisis and outside the crisis period. So what we can actually learn from this figure is that for technologies with low degree of relatedness, they have about 70% less likely to enter in a crisis, in cities during a crisis as compared to a non-crisis period. So technologies with a low degree of relatedness have a very low probability to enter during crisis as compared to non-crisis period. Well, if you can see for technologies with a high degree of relatedness, you can actually see that the entry probability is higher as compared to technologies with a low degree of relatedness. So technologies with a high degree of relatedness, there the entry probability is only about 25% smaller during crisis than outside the crisis period. So meaning that regions tend to diversify more in related activities during crisis than non-crisis periods. So this confirms our hypothesis. Indeed, if cities diversify, our first hypothesis shows that they are less likely to do so. But if they diversify during crisis period, they stay very close to what they have been doing in the past. So they stay. So the technologies that they enter are very related to existing technologies that are already present in the region. So they won't make any jumps. They won't make any radical breakthroughs in period of crisis because it is just too risky and too uncertain. So, and this is nicely confirmed by our study. So, concluding my remarks, and this is my last slide. Evolutionary perspective on regional resilience. As I said, we have done some studies now looking at skill relatedness, to what extent the ability of regions to diversify into new economic activities is negatively affected by a crisis. As I said, it's also very much work in progress. For example, local supply of skill-related industries is quite a crucial shock absorber, but to what extent does it also affect diversification in cities? Because it might be the case that if people move from one sector to another during a crisis period, it might also give new impulses to the industries they go to, because they might bring in new ideas, new innovations, and therefore it might affect positively the diversification process. There are many other aspects that we should take into account, but maybe I should leave that to the discussion. Also, for example, the effect of local institutions is a very important element that we should take into account. And of course, last but not least, what are the policy implications, right? I didn't say anything about policy yet, but of course, it is very much on the research agenda, but not much work yet there in that respect. Okay, thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you very much, Ron. That was very, very nice presentation. I really liked it. Also touched upon a lot of also the issues that I'm facing in my research. So now if you have a question, you can type it in the chat or ask directly via the camera. And we're already having a question here by Takashi. Sorry if I say it wrong. Who is curious if you could elaborate a little bit more on the effect of local institutions on resilience.
Right. Yes. In fact, I've done already one paper on that with Roberto Antonietti, who's teaching in Padua. And there we looked at the notion of bridging and bonding social capital, and to what extent that might matter for regions to be resilient in the 2008 crisis. And we looked at that. And what we found is that bridging social capital is a quite important factor in that respect, because bridging social capital is a kind of proxy for a society in which different social groups are integrated and at least interact with each other, right? So it's a kind of society that is inclusive in a way. So if you have an inclusive society, you're more likely to diversify also during periods of crisis, because society is the societal factor underlying it can make those will favor those type of combinations. So we find a kind of effect there, and bonding social capital is always pretty bad for diversification to take place, because it consists of many different groups in society that do not interact, and therefore, because if you want to diversify, you have to recombine resources, you have to recombine different activities, and if a society is not really does not have a potential to do so, or at least not has shown in the past, it will be more difficult to diversify, and this is actually what we observe in the data. So it might be the case that indeed institutions might be an important ingredient for regional resilience, and this is a study we did in Italy on the level of provinces. So I think there are about 80 or 90 different provinces, so I can't exactly recall the number, but so this is one way to go forward, but this is only one study, and I guess there are many other possibilities to explore more in detail in order to link institutions and regional resilience.
Okay, thank you very much. Anybody else having a question? Don't be shy. Okay. Igor is asking a question. I'm just gonna read it out. So he mentioned that a great part of the resilience literature seems to be more concerned with those sudden disruptive recessive shocks. And he would like to know how to appropriate the evolutionary perspective of resilience can be to deal and analyze the impacts of the more slow burn processes, such as also climate change and deindustrialization.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, deindustrialization, of course, is a major part of those studies as well, right? So it's about, as I said, I mean, deindustrialization, okay, many countries and many regions have been subject to deindustrialization. That's already, well, that is part and parcel of any economy, right? So, but especially since the 1970s and 1980s, many countries and many regions have been hit by this process of deindustrialization, and then you can actually try to analyze to what extent countries and regions have been resilient in order to do so. And resilience then does not mean that you are able to withstand that pressure from, for example, low-wage countries. But to what extent have you been capable into moving into new directions? To what extent have you been able to compensate for this process of deindustrialization? So many countries and regions have indeed done so by moving more into service-oriented economies, right? So in order to compensate, or at least partially, for the loss of the manufacturing industry in their countries and regions. But of course, you can also look at it from a sustainability perspective. To what extent regions are resilient in order to cope with all kinds of sustainable challenges. and to what extent they're capable of moving into new green technologies or all kinds of new green economic activities. So again, you might analyze those slow burn challenges and see to what extent we have now a kind of environmental crisis, right? To what extent countries and regions are capable of participating and contributing to solving that problem and moving to a more green economy. And of course, you would see tremendous differences between countries and regions in terms of their commitment to move into new green technologies, but also their capabilities to move into. Because you might have also a kind of strong will to move into new green technologies, but it might not necessarily be the case that you also have the capabilities to do so. And this, I think, is part and parcel of our evolutionary approach, in that we look at those capabilities, and then we can actually observe that regions and countries differ in their potential to move into new green economies, and that should be exploited. And then, of course, policy comes into the debate. To what extent can you still make a difference as a policymaker when your region does not really have capabilities to move into new green technologies or into a new green economy? So these are all kinds of questions that we have to address. But I think it's a very interesting and very challenging. And I know that people are currently working on these kind of issues for now. So it's a research agenda that will develop in the next 5 or 10 years for sure.
All right, thank you very much. We're having a lot of questions coming in now. That's great. Let's see how many we can take. So Diego, hi Diego, is asking if it would be possible that crises have a curve effect, where the marginal effect of skill relatedness reach an optimal point, but is less than the extremes. It seems to him that intuitively crises might have a window of major effects at a certain point. What do you think about that?
Sorry, I missed the noise. The sound went away the last 5 seconds or so.
Okay. So Diego is asking whether it's possible that the crisis has a curve effect, where the marginal effect of skill relatedness reach an optimal point, but less than the extreme. It seems to him that intuitively crisis might have a window of major effect until a certain point.
Yeah, I think what is mentioned here is that so it might be the case that if you diversify into related industries, you might still become locked in at some point of time, right? Which might not be good for the capacity of a region to diversify in the long run. So there might be kind of so you also might have to move a bit more far from what you're doing in order to avoid this process of lock-in. Lock-in might even be considered as a way of a region that will lose its resilience because it becomes so specialized in one particular area or topic that as soon as circumstances will change, external circumstances, it might not be capable of adapting itself to that. So there is a kind of risk of when diversifying in related directions all the time, you might get stuck at some point in time, and you might have to move and make a jump. So there might be a natural tendency of regions to become less resilient over time in that respect. So I'm not sure whether that can be observed, but it's a nice hypothesis and nice thesis, and that's for us to decide test it.
All right, thank you. Then Benjamin is having a very quick question, I guess. So he really liked the map that you showed on Europe, and was wondering if you produced a similar map also for the study on the US.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yes. Well, we have done. I spoke about the study on the US. We didn't make maps, but of course you can make maps, as many as you want. And indeed, those maps are also quite telling, right? So of course, I also have a background in geography. So to me, yeah, a map like this, you can talk for hours on that. So it seems that many East European countries show quite a high degree of resilience, which does not come as a surprise, because they have done quite well during and after the 2008 crisis. And they're converging, right? So within the European Union. So I think this is already very interesting to see, hey, what's going on there. This is of course a study that takes all regions into account, and then is just doing some estimations. But you could just also go into a number of cases and explore them more in detail. To know more about what's going on in every region. So yes, but yeah, maps you can make as much as you want with this type of phenomena.
All right. Thank you very much, Ron. I think we have to stop at this point. We're already a little bit over the time. Yeah, thank you very much to all participants, and most of all to you, Ron. It was really nice to have you here, and we got a lot of participants, up to 25. That's quite good for a webinar. So you were really popular, Ron. Okay, and then yeah, lastly, just to mention again, if you guys are interested in relatedness and complexity and development, we have this open call for our workshop in Santiago in June. Check it out. Would be great to see many of those participants there. All right.
All right.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ron.
Yeah, thank you for all listening and participating.
Bye-bye.